Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of the Python tutorial series. Today we will finally write our first full piece of code, but first let's look at today's topic, for loops. For loops allow us to automatically repeat the same action multiple times. In particular, for loops iterate through the elements of a series in order to determine how many times to repeat the action. As you can see, the syntax of a for loop is quite simple. All you have to do is write for a free variable, which in this case we have called x, in an iterable, which can be a tuple, a list, a range, a series, pretty much anything. In this case, it's a list of letters from A to G. And then below that, you write the action, which in this case is simply print x. At each iteration, the free variable x takes on the value of each of the elements in the list in turn. So, in the first iteration, x will be equal to a, and therefore the action will be print a. The output will therefore be the letter A. Similarly, in the second iteration, the value of x will be b, and the action will be print b, and consequently the output will be the letter b. And this is true for all the subsequent iterations, where the value of x will then be c, d, e, f, and g in turn. So in this case, the for loop will have 7 iterations, because the length of the list we have given it is of 7 elements. Now let's write our first full piece of code using for loops. Our task for today will be to substitute the values in a list with their squares. So first, let's write the list to be converted. Let's call it our first list, and we'll assign the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now let's calculate the length of the list. So we'll say length of list is equal to len of our first list. Then let's derive the set of indices for our first list. We can do that by calling variable indices and saying that this is equal to range of length of list. Now let's apply our for loop. We'll say for I in indices. We need to now extract each element from our list. So we will say element equals our first list I. We will then square the element and say element squared equals element asterisk asterisk, so double asterisk means squared, 2. Finally, we will reassign the element we have squared to our original list. So we will say our first list I equals element squared. Finally, we will print the completed list so that we can display it on our screen. So let's write print our first list. Now, as you can see in this code, the first thing we did is write the list to be converted. Second is we derived the length of that list using the len command. Thirdly, we derived the indices for the elements in our list using the length of the list. Now remember that the length of the list is 8, and range of 8 will give us the values 0 through to 7, which are exactly the indices of the elements in our list. Because remember that indexing goes from 0 to 7. If you're unsure on how to use the range function, make sure to click on the banner above to view my tutorial on the print and range function. After having derived the indices of the elements in the list, we iterate through those indices with a for loop. So we say for I in indices. For each of those indices, we extract the relative element from our list. So in this case, it will extract the number 1, then the number 2, then the number 3, etc., etc. We then take that element and square it, and then reassign it to our list using the same index we used to extract it in the first place. So, for example, our first element, the number 1, will be taken out of the list in line 17, it will be squared in line 20, and it will be reassigned to the list in the same position in line 23. Now that we have reviewed our code and made sure that there are no errors, click on F5 on your keyboard to run the code. As you can see, we have a printed list on the right containing the squares of the numbers we specified in the beginning. So if you compare the numbers 1 through to 8 with the numbers 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, etc., you will see that these values are the squares of our first list, which is exactly what we wanted. Congratulations, you have just finished writing your first piece of functioning code. If you have any questions about what we have just done, make sure to leave a comment below. Otherwise, let's move on to writing a second piece of code. In our second piece of code, we will be calculating the cumulative sum of each element in a list. So if we write our second list is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the cumulative sum will be 1, then 1 plus 2, then 1 plus 2 plus 3, then 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and then 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. So, in this case, we can't reassign the elements to the list because we need them at each iteration. So we have to write an empty target list, which we will call target underscore list, and just leave it as an empty list. And we will use this list to insert the values we calculate. As before, we will calculate the length of the list by saying length of list equals len of our second list. Then, as before, we will derive the set of indices for our list. So we will say indices equals range of length of list. In this example, we are using lists. If you can't remember how to use them or want to review the topic, make sure to click on the banner above that will link you to my tutorial where I go through all the details of how to use lists. Now that we have created the list of indices for our list, let's apply the for loop as in the previous example. So we will write for I in indices. Now we will generate a subset of our list containing all the elements with indices from 0 to I. So we will call it subset, and this will be equal to our second list, let's spell it correctly, of 0 to I plus 1. If you want to revise advanced indexing techniques like this, make sure to click on the banner above and watch my tutorial on advanced indexing techniques. Now let's move on with our code. We have generated the subset of our list, so now we have to add its elements together in order to create the sum. So we will call this result, and this will be equal to sum of our subset. Now the sum function is, as the name suggests, an inbuilt Python function that calculates the sum of all the elements inside a list. In this case, the list is our subset, and therefore, using this technique, we can calculate the cumulative sum of our primary list. We now have to assign the result to our target list. So we will say target list dot append result. Finally, we will print our completed list. So we'll write print target list. As before, let's review our code first. First thing we did is write out the list to be converted. Second is we wrote an empty list that we will fill with the cumulative sums of our list. Third thing, and fourth, as with the previous example, is we created the length of the list, and using that we created the list of indices for our second list. We then iterated over these indices, and for each index we created a subset of our second list, calculated its sum, and appended this result to the target list. Finally, we printed our target list so that we can display the result. Now that we have reviewed our code, as in the previous example, click on F5 to run the code and display the result. As you can see here on the right, we now have the values 1, 3, 6, 10 and 15, which are the cumulative sums of our intended list. So, our code works. This brings us to the end of this episode. Next week, we will have a new tutorial where we will investigate while loops, an even trickier form of iteration. As usual, in the meantime, if you have any questions, leave a comment below, and make sure to like, share this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming videos.